Hi, Vanessa.
Hello, Adam.
Welcome to Uncertain Things. Today we have returning guest, the one and only Einat Wilf, Dr. Einat Wilf, co-author of The War of Return, and now also the chair of the newly formed Israeli Oz Party. So, Einat, welcome to Uncertain Things. Welcome back.
Good to be back. Things. Yes.
Last time we had you on, it was right after October 7th, and it was about the book that you wrote long before October 7th, which I originally read in Hebrew, about the refugee industrial complex perpetuated by UNRWA as it pertains to the Palestinian crisis and how that perpetuates the very crisis that it pretends to try to resolve. It was a fan favorite of ours because it did set so many things in place, including what is Zionism, what is the history of Zionism, and how institutions that seem to be in the service of a good that everybody can get behind, like who can be against helping war refugees, like the Palestinians who had to escape or pushed out after 1947, actually can serve to immiserate their existence and ossify their status as perpetual refugees, perennial refugees. That was fascinating and illuminating for so many of our listeners. And now we are almost 2.5, 3 years past that. There have been multiple wars waged in your region, my home region of the Levant, and most of those wars have technically concluded. So I wanted to bring you here to understand, where do we stand with all of that? So did we win? Did we lose? Who is we? What is the Middle East now?
So technically over, I think, is a very precise term because the question is which war was being waged, which war therefore concluded or didn't conclude. And here I'll deal specifically with Gaza, given also that this is particularly my focus and specialty. One of my main criticisms, as I'm sure you know, within Israel, is that we didn't actually understand where the war was taking place. And if I were to put it in percentages, I say that about 30% of the war took place in Gaza, physically. And to that war, we appeared and we were heroes and people
we showed up. We showed up for that war.
We showed up for that one. Absolutely. The other 70%, which therefore I argue is the majority, basically took place globally. It was a global war against the Jewish people, a global war on Zionism, an assault on the possibility, I would say, of proud, thriving Jewish life anywhere in the world. And my argument is that for that war, not only we were a no-show, we actually didn't understand both the fact that this war was taking place. I think we still don't understand how dangerous it is. And our enemies clearly understood that this was the main war that was taking place. And as a result, I would say that that war has clearly not been concluded. And I would definitely not say that we won that war.
Okay, so let's start by dealing with the question that arises whenever anybody from the Zio camp tries to disentangle what's happening in Gaza and the global hullabaloo. The immediate response is, how can you expect people to be quiet about Zionism in the rest of the world when we are looking at the destruction that takes place in Gaza?
So this is actually a perfect question that demonstrates really where the war was taking place. The notion that what people were seeing on their screens, and their response were somehow innocent responses to something that was objective. So I actually want to take this opportunity to say something about Gaza, about the nature of the war, in order to really demonstrate how far the actual situation is from the global war of libels that was taking place.
The war, the situation in Gaza, the actual kinetic war in Gaza.
Exactly. So I want to kind of literally set the stage, which is what our enemies did. Ahead of the invasion and massacre of October 7th, our enemies, Hamas ruled Gaza, essentially weaponized the entire strip. It's worth saying a few words about what that meant. There was hundreds of kilometers of tunnels that were connected through hundreds of piers in almost every home, mosque, school, kindergarten. In all those places, stashes of weapons were prepared ahead of time in anticipation of the invasion and the massacre. This is something that you can generally do among
in anticipation of Hamas's invasion into Israel on October 7th, you mean?
Yeah, this is how they prepared their attack. Now, this kind of level of preparations, the tunnels, the digging, the stashes, the piers, is something that you can do when you have a broadly supportive population that understands that all of this is prepared in the service of the goal that unfortunately they all share, that it's more important to destroy what the Jews have built rather than to build something for themselves and to use the objectively good assets of Gaza to turn Gaza into a global center of tourism, commerce, export, all of which Gaza has the objective conditions to be. But again, it was understood by the population that all of this was being done on behalf of something that they deeply believe in, that it's more important to destroy the Jewish state than to use Gaza in order to build something worthwhile for themselves. Now,
and sorry, what's the logic behind, just to remind you, I remain the curious layman once again. What is the connection between tunnels enabling them to destroy the Jewish state?
It's not just the tunnels, it's the entire weaponization of the Gaza Strip. It's important to remind ourselves, we're used to thinking of Gaza as this miserable place, right? This place of misery that requires aid. And what about the aid? And what about the aid? And we somehow think of Gaza as objectively as a place of misery, not noticing that, it's not some landlocked, windswept desert in the middle of nowhere. It actually sits on one of the most beautiful strips of beaches in the world at the crossroads of ancient trade routes. It has fertile soil. It literally has objectively all the conditions to become a hub of tourism, trade. There's nothing objectively that prevents Gaza from being a flourishing and successful place. The tragedy is that the people of Gaza, and that is the tragedy, it's almost without exception, are united not around a positive, constructive goal of building for themselves, but around the destructive goal that it's more important to use Gaza as a launch pad for what they call liberating Palestine, but is essentially the vision of no Jewish state, no sovereign Jews anywhere in the land. So therefore, when this is your ideology and worldview, and you come into the possession of this asset, territory, billions of dollars from the international community, the goodwill and gullibility of Israelis and many Westerners who think you just want to build for yourselves, then you take all the cement that goes in, all the billions that go in. I remember for years, Israel being pressured, let in more cement. Not enough cement is going in. Now we know why there was not enough cement. And I remember already in 2018, based on the book, The War of Return, saying, listen to the Gazans. What do you think they're going to do with cement? And I'm saying it in 2018. I don't have special intelligence. I just give the Gazans the respect of taking them at their word. I say, what do you think is going to happen when you give them cement? They're telling you that as far as they're concerned, Gaza is not their home. Gaza is a launch pad, again, to so-called liberate Palestine from any sovereign Jews. They're going to use the cement to build tunnels in order to conduct their operations for there not to be sovereign Jews in the land. So that's the connection. And the tunnels are part of how you conduct the warfare. So they turn Gaza into a single weaponized urban landscape. It's not just urban warfare. It's something of a totally new category. They turn the entire landscape into something that is connected and weaponized. Now, that's element number one.
Can you explain just for our listeners? Two things I think is important. We've discussed some of this in the past, so we don't need to dwell too much, but just to understand the context. A, you're saying that the Hamas government and the with the blessing supposedly of some of the Gazan people weaponized the territory rather than go for a more constructive vision. What is the response to, again, the knee-jerk comment that I heard many times from Zaire critics saying that, well, they weren't able to really leverage the benefits of their ports and being in the nexus of historical trade routes because they were under an Israeli blockade. So what do you expect them to do? They are trying to break out of prison, right? That was the slogan. Gaza finally broke out of prison. Israelis pretended to give the strip back to the Palestinians, while in fact imposing a blockade that made life impossible and required weaponizing in order to breach those restrictions imposed by their neighbors.
So to make that argument, you need to ignore two things. First, the timeline, and two, what Gazans actually say. Which is, by the way, how most people tell the conflict. They ignore what the Arabs actually say and they invert the timeline. One of my favorite ways in which the entire story of the conflict is mistold is the inversion of cause and effect. The blockade actually happens much after Israel gets out of Gaza, because Gaza essentially, rather than focusing on building it for itself, immediately goes to war and immediately attacks Israel as soon as Israel actually retreats. And here is the second half, because if you actually listen to the people of Gaza, if you actually listen to the Arabs of Gaza, of the Palestinian Authority, of the West Bank, to their credit, really, they have been consistent and clear for over a century that their goal is not to achieve something for themselves, such as a state or independence or sovereignty, which would be a constructive goal, but that their goal is first and foremost to ensure that there is no Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. And at any point in the last 15 years, the people of Gaza were repeatedly told, all you have to do is to renounce your goal of no Jewish state, and that's it. The blockade will be over. But that is the one thing that they did not want to do. So again, you got to give them credit for consistency and clarity, and also the fact that their words are consistent with their deeds.
It also sounds like you're suggesting that they just have a lot more agency than the narrative that Adam is explaining gives them, that despite the blockade, they had room to maneuver.
They always did.
Before the blockade, during the blockade, and after the blockade, in all those stages, they have made choices
Precisely.
that were their own.
Yes.
And I think this is what I love about how you're framing this, Einat. It's the point being that this is giving them the respect of their preferences, of their real will, which is not the imposed, manufactured will that the UN imagines. We'll talk about the UN later, but it is what their words say and the consistency of their words, the alignment of their words with their actions throughout history.
And when we're saying they, are we just predominantly discussing like a leadership class or something like that? Or how are we defining they in this context?
It would be comforting if it were just a leadership class. One of the comforting lies is, the Arabs of Gaza, the Arabs of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, they are led astray by evil leaders. It's a comforting lie. Many people like to tell it. If anything, as we also show in the book, The War of Return, if anything, the story is tragically the opposite. Leaders that have essentially no room to maneuver because they are captured by a people where there is, again, tragically, almost no exceptions except for a few very brave souls who are united in their view that their very identity means that it's more important to destroy what the Jews have built rather than to build something for themselves. Now, I'll say that I know that this is one of the most difficult things I say. Before October 7th, it met with much more resistance. Obviously, after October 7th, given once more the consistency of their vision, words with reality, more people were willing to listen to that. Also noticing the euphoria in Gaza and in the West Bank. More people were willing to listen to that. But still, obviously, it's a terrible kind of idea for people to comprehend that you actually have millions of people, if not more, united in a destructive vision rather than a constructive one. And throughout the years, whenever people challenged me on this analysis, I would always tell them, go ahead and prove me wrong. It's the easiest thing you can do if I'm wrong. Find me Palestinian Arabs who, in their own words and publicly, because only what is being said publicly in the Arab world is of value, say that their vision of peace is to live next to a Jewish state rather than on its ruins and from the river to the sea, and that they understand that the implication of that, and these are the two most reliable litmus tests I've discovered, is that they understand that they are not fifth generation Palestine refugees and that there is no such thing as what they call the right of return, which is their vision of millions of Arabs settling inside Israel. And in a 20-year search and journey for these people, I found 4, 5. That's it. So I've been challenging people for years to prove me wrong, and yet to happen.
And just to clarify, go back, listen to our conversation with Einat, go read The War of Return or watch the recent film on which Einat was a leading consultant. What's the name of the film again?
Unraveling UNRWA.
Unraveling UNRWA. All of these will give more data and context to what Einat means by assessing the general tone in the population and the culture that has emerged that focuses on the destruction of Israel as its founding cause, its uniting goal. I think it's important just to note, and again, this will send you down searching these questions yourself, dear listener, that this is not an essentialist argument. This is not to say that going all the way back to 1940s and 1920, we're looking at exactly the same phenomena and the same culture. Those things have evolved for different reasons. There are the post-imperial culture of the Arab world and the pan-Arabist culture of the Arab world in the 1920s and 1930s that then influenced the original relationship of the local population, the local Arabs with the Jewish immigrants. Then there's obviously the Israeli War of Independence and the Nakba that creates a founding myth for this new anti-Zionist culture. And then later this gets perpetuated and indoctrinated in part by the new anti-colonial Palestinian complex, which is informed very much by the global left and the Soviet Union, as well getting ratified by the UN and UNRWA and this is a big, big, big story, and we spent 2 hours trying to just poke at it last time we had Einat here. So I do want to make sure that people who start with this conversation don't make the assumption on we're making any kind of essentialist argument about the nature of the people. This is a long cultural, political, and sociological development that has its roots in many, 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 many complicated developments over the past 100 years. I will stop here. Please continue.
I'll add that, if anything, sometimes I'm criticized by the right that I am not an essentialist, that precisely because I've seen how this ideology has been indulged and funded and fueled, I support removing the fuel in the belief that it is possible to ultimately change this ideology away from destruction and into construction. I have a new book that just came out in Israel in Hebrew called Peace Not Now. It's being translated into English. And that's very much its core message, that we can go in a new direction that once removes the fuel and the generators that allow this identity to emerge, it can actually be transformed into something constructive. So, but if I go back to Gaza, which many ways where this is centered, so not only is Gaza made into this single integrated weaponized landscape, the enemy develops a war doctrine that essentially erases the line between civilian and combatant. Now, all the laws of war are based on this distinction. Like the whole system of the international laws of war and humanitarian laws of war are based on the notion that there is a distinction between civilian and combatant. Now, we face an enemy who's made it the way that they fight to erase that distinction. Except on the day of the invasion and massacre and during those grotesque hostage the hostage release ceremonies, then they wear their uniforms. But other than that, they're always in civilian clothing, going underground or above ground in civilian clothing. The whole way in which they fight is about erasing that. Then you add to that the fact that they hold hostages, which so many in the world normalized as a negotiating situation rather than tell them Israel owes you nothing, release them. Add to that, then in every other normal conflict, everywhere in the world, the so-called humanitarian community calls upon the neighboring nation to allow people to escape the theater of war, should they choose to do so. In this case, Gaza has a border with Egypt. I like to call it the disappearing border with Egypt. People seem to not notice it. There was zero pressure placed on Egypt to allow those in Gaza who didn't want to be in the theater of war to leave, because it was called ethnic cleansing if they will be allowed to leave, and genocide if they are forced, as they were forced by so-called humanitarian organizations to remain in a theater of war. So if you kind of sum all these, Gaza, as prepared for years as a single weaponized theater of war where everything is connected in tunnels and piers and pre-prepared stashes, holding hostages, erasing the distinction of combatant and civilian, not allowing civilians to escape the theater of war. If you put all of that together and you realize that the civilian to combatant ratio that was achieved in the war by the Israeli side towards the Gazan side is about 1-to-1, some say even lower, or 1-to-2. Actually, what emerges is that the way that Israel conducted the war was exemplary. And I know that what I'm saying now is tough, but I insist on it because so many people have been under this constant assault of libels that they seem to think that, you know, there's no fire without smoke. There's no smoke without fire. And I'm like, you actually don't even begin to comprehend the kind of the vast gulf between what actually happened And I always say that 10 years from now, what I'm saying now will be written up in some obscure military journal, which no one will read, but it's going to be 10 years from now and nobody cares because the libels have already run like crazy. But I'm emphasizing this for those who actually have a sense that this has been a global assault on Jewish life by extending libels. And I want them to actually understand how extraordinary what actually happened in the way that Israel conducted this war.
Can I ask two clarifying questions? You mentioned the borders and the inability for Gazans to leave. Who was policing those borders? Like, were there efforts to leave and people just weren't allowed to, and by whom? And then I have a secondary question about the thing that I hear all the time, which is like the starvation. To what extent is there starvation?
So first 6 months after the invasion and massacre by Hamas-ruled Gaza, Israel didn't go into Rafah. Remember, all eyes on Rafah and all that, for 6 months, Gaza had an uninterrupted border with Egypt. And of course, it had it for 15 years earlier, too, when, the people of Gaza.
Just for geographical context, because I'm sure that even the people who did post all eyes on Rafah have no idea where it is. It is in the south of the Strip, right next. It's one of the denser urban parts. That's why the concern of the humanitarian crisis was so big, and it is right on the. Unsurprisingly, the Rafah crossing, which is one of the connection points with Egypt that Israel was very hesitant for the first part of the war to take over.
Yes. And I was actually working with Shimon Peres in 2005 when Israel retreated completely from the Gaza Strip. It's important to say Israel retreated out of 80% of the Gaza Strip in Gaza already, but in the 90s. But when it did to the full 100% in 2005, I was there when the Prime Minister Ariel Sharon made the very dramatic choice to get out of Gaza's border with Egypt, out of what's called the Philadelphia Corridor, precisely because he was determined that we will leave no excuses. There will be no excuses. The people of Gaza will have zero excuses to say, oh, Israel's still here. We will completely leave. What I think we all underestimated greatly is the ability of Gazans and their enablers to make up new excuses. But Gaza had a border with Egypt. Before October 7th, clearly a border through which many of the weapons came through. And it had a border until Israel entered Rafah, and I think it was April 24. So for about 6 months, Gaza's certainly in the beginning have the ability to leave into Egypt. But Egypt, as some people noticed, very quickly moves to construct a massive wall in order not to enable Gazans, their so-called, dear brothers for whom supposedly their heart aches, in order to prevent them from leaving the theater of war. And not a single so-called humanitarian organization placed any pressure on Egypt or turned any kind of spotlight on Egypt of why are you not letting people out? Because, of course, had they done that, the war would have been over very quickly with a clear Israeli victory. And in many ways, all these organizations and Egypt were complicit in ensuring that it became essentially impossible for Israel to win by forcing people who wanted to escape into staying in the theater of war. And again, add to that the hostages and the entire libelous campaign. So the libelous campaign brings me to your second question. Again, to highlight how absolutely insane is even the assumption that from the lawns through which Hamas-ruled Gaza invaded Israel, massacred Israelis, the assumption that Israel was actually under any obligation to supply its enemy while fighting it. And again, no one talks about Egypt and the fact that, if you want to supply Gaza, do it through Egypt. Why was the assumption that this is Israel's responsibility? So the whole starvation campaign was clearly orchestrated. We go back to the 70% of the war where Israel did not understand that much of the war was about spreading libels and by essentially making it impossible for Israel to win. And I want to say something. Look, we are now in a position where at the end of all this, Hamas continues to rule Gaza, half of it. So there is still Gaza-ruled Hamas. Qatar has been very effective with this global libelous campaign to use the hostages in order to ensure, it really used the hostages like a knob, where it releases them in a way that is measured to secure the Hamas rule over Gaza. And in that sense, they've been successful.
I want to give the hunger question just one more. I think that even if you convince people, which obviously people who don't want to be convinced won't be, but even if you were to get people to nod along and say, okay, yeah, technically it's weird that a sovereign country that came under an attack now is expected to provide for the struggling population that we are essentially keeping there, that we, the international community, are essentially keeping within the war zone and not letting them escape. And yet, given all these conditions, the game has been rigged against Israel in such a way that the delivery of aid trucks falls squarely on the Israeli-controlled checkpoints, because the rest of the world, again, we understand, because we're intelligent people, that the world does not care about Palestinians dying, that in fact there are parts of the world that thrive, that benefit politically and geopolitically from the death of Palestinians, that for them this is the currency and the end result that they are seeking. And yet, Israelis who understand this calculus, not out of the generosity of their hearts, not out of any desire to play along with the saboteurs and the anti-Zionist vision, but out of an understanding that the only move in that regard is to allow for this to do their best to prevent any more images of starvation coming out of Gaza. What did Israel do in regards to that?
So again, those are two separate things. Israel, as I said, went above and beyond in, of course, supplying its enemy at a time of war in a way that is unprecedented and unparalleled, extending essentially the war in doing so, because you continue to supply your enemy. The images that came out of Gaza had nothing to do with reality. So this was a well-orchestrated campaign to ensure that Israel is forced to continue to supply its enemy so that its enemy can continue to fight it. This is how insane it is. And again, it was a successful campaign, I think, in many ways, because Israel also failed to, I think, set the stage in the beginning that this should not be our responsibility. And again, to begin with, that the hostages should be released. I'm reminding everyone that at this point, when again, the images are kind of created and disseminated, all controlled by Hamas, they are holding hostages and they are absolutely in the position. And, it would be nice if people actually said, just release the hostages. But even that was not on the table. So
let me ask you the opposite question of this then.
Yes.
Let me ask you the opposite. Why understanding everything that we just said. And I would have expected people, especially from the most right-wing government that Israel has ever had, to have that sensibility. So I'm putting aside the people who just are, know nothing but bloviation of insane rhetoric and do no good to Israel, no service to Israel, because they don't have any strategic bone in their body. But what about the people who are intelligent, if any such remain in Israeli governance? Why did they get stuck in this halfway approach all throughout the war? It seems to me that you could go either all in on trying to release the hostages and say, Hamas, you beat us on October 7th. We have lost. There is no way for us to solve this puzzle. We will give you whatever you want to get all the hostages back. Or you can say, we're not giving you an inch. We're not playing along with this game that you've rigged against us. You want your population starves? That's fine. Talk to Egypt. You want support? That's fine. Talk to the UN. We're not going to help the UN. We're now in the business of demolishing everything we find in Gaza, and we're not going to ask questions. And if that kills the hostages, that's a tragedy that we'll have to deal with. But going all in on, we are now destroying an enemy that is treated us genocidally. So we're going to go in and destroy you. Those seem to me both understandable strategic choices. We have been stuck in the let's get the worst of both worlds approach, it seems. We, at the same time, go in on a very aggressive war while also trying to apologize for the images that emerge. We go in and destroy try to destroy the Hamas infrastructure, but then say, but we also feel responsible to bring in the aid and support it. But then say, but the aid did go in, and then we have to argue this picture doesn't capture what we did, and then we're really falling into the trap of trying to play a game that we have no chance of winning. Why? That's the question. Why? And how can you say, if given this, that we remotely have been successful in this war? It seems to me that we have failed on every account. I mean, I'm very glad that we were able to get all the hostages that we did get at the end for the human reasons. But in terms of strategic advantage, it seems like we have failed on almost every count.
So you kind of answered your question with the way you set it up in the beginning. There's a famous, of course, saying by Teddy Roosevelt about that the art of governance, certainly foreign policy, is to speak softly and carry a big stick. And you're right. We have been, I would say, plagued by a government that is most known for speaking loudly and carrying a small stick. And I say that in many ways, that's exactly related, because if you end up kind of yelling and screaming and screeching, then you also find yourself constantly pressed to then capitulate. Whereas if you actually master the ability to speak wisely and strategically, and to also actually, I would say, truthfully, because as you know, one of the criticisms, I think I might have mentioned it in our previous podcast, one of my main and first criticisms of the government, and it's related to not understanding where the war was waged, is that we pretended that this is a war only against Hamas. And I compare it to Roosevelt declaring war on Japanese pilots in the wake of the Pearl Harbor attack, basically telling Americans, we are now going to war against Japanese pilots. Every time we kill a Japanese pilot, we're going to publish a photo with an X on it. And once we have about 10,000, 20,000 Japanese pilots, we're going to call it a day. That's not how wars are fought, how they're waged. Wars as peace are done on a collective basis. We should have made it clear, certainly after what they did. And I will say that much of the world doesn't even understand. I say even in Israel, we don't even begin to understand what they did that day. After what they did, this war should have been declared as a war to end Palestinianism, like Nazism, like imperial Japanese racial supremacy, as the governing ideology of the people of Gaza, at the minimum.
last time you were here, for our listener, people who know you will probably recognize the term, but last time you were here, you did not yet coin that phrase. So I think just explaining what you mean by Palestinianism, and which is one of your intentionally provocative terms. But I love our listeners will have missed the eyebrow raise of a not saying provocative. I think it's an accurate description.
You get me. Yes, even though I described the ideology that has essentially come to define the Palestinians, as we described, the prioritizing of destroying Jewish sovereignty over building something for themselves, it is indeed only after October 7th that I felt the need to give it a name so that it becomes clear that it's an ideology that became an identity rather than just some normal national identity seeking sovereignty. And I basically gave it the term Palestinianism. And my definition of Palestinianism is this singular obsession with the non-existence of a Jewish state, or the ideology of prioritizing the destruction of the Jewish state over building something for the Arabs. So I've come to call that Palestinianism. I have to say it seems to have caught on because it seems to have really filled a need to explain what we're really fighting.
And the contrast to that, which is one of the goals in your party's founding charter, is I don't remember if you call it Palestinian or Arab Zionism.
So one of the things I realized, and maybe it also is based on your podcast on anti-Zionism, there's actually no middle ground. You're either a Zionist or you're an anti-Zionist. The notion that it's possible to be neutral, if there ever was, is long gone. So since Palestinianism at its core is anti-Zionism, it's an ideology that is waged for destruction rather than for a constructive purpose. Once you remove anti-Zionism from Palestinianism, you essentially create a constructive Arab identity. You can still be an Arab and a Muslim and a Zionist. That is precisely my argument, that if you take anti-Zionism out of Palestinianism, not much, if at all, remains. But if you take anti-Zionism from an Arab or a Muslim identity, there's culture, there's history, there's architecture, there's poetry, there's literature. There is an identity and a culture and the possibility of being Arab and Muslim without being obsessively anti-Zionist. And happily, we're beginning to see the emergence of that kind of Arab and Muslim identity. So we go back to your comment about essentialism, precisely because I'm not an essentialist, and precisely because I think ideologies like Nazism, like the Imperial Japan, like Palestinianism can be redone if you remove the fuel and the oxygen and the support for those ideologies. This is precisely my vision for what Israel should promote as the thing that essentially organizes its foreign and defense policy, to move from Palestinianism as the ideology of our enemies to a Middle East that is at least defined by strong pockets of Arab Zionism. And Arab Zionism at its core merely means that these are Arabs and Muslims who are not obsessed with destroying the Jewish state and are willing to live next to it rather than on its ruins. But I have to say that I also mean it in another sense. It means Zionism as an ideology of can-do, of building, of future-looking. This is why the Emiratis, it's not a coincidence that the Emiratis are not obsessing over destroying Israel, because they're building for themselves. And anti-Zionism, as I'm sure you discussed, is the ideology of failed societies who are looking for scapegoats, who to blame. So when I speak of a Zionist Middle East, of Arab and Islamic Zionism, I also speak not only of the recognition that the Jews are not foreigners in their historic homeland, that they have the right to self-determination. I also mean that it's an Arab and Muslim world that is busy building that is focused on creating a positive future for itself rather than always explaining its failures by blaming the Jews.
I mean, your point about the anti-Zionism being the ideology of failed societies.
I also picked up on that part.
It is no coincidence that that anti-Zionism is now an inseparable ingredient with any kind of third world resentment, anti-capitalism, anti-growth, anti-Americanism, anything that represents the model of post-Enlightenment industrial growth and liberalization is now recast as the target for destruction, resentment, and upheaval. And Zionism is just seen as, depending on who you are, either the vanguard of all of that or the root cause of all of it, depending on what your priorities are. Are you more anti-American or more anti-Jewish? But either way, those are inseparable tenets in the enemy list of the resentment movement.
Adel, did you mean to say first world? Because I think you said third world.
Third world resentment.
Okay, so because I'm thinking first world, because I'm thinking like that exact movement that you're outlining is growing happily for first world America.
Well, no, for sure. But the underlying ideology is a third world resentment that is just being taught at elite universities. Decolonialism, the ideology of decolonialism is third world resentment packaged in a pseudo-sophisticated way for the bitter peace-privileged and wealth-privileged American to feel like they are part of something bigger. By the way, total side note, last night I had a conversation, a fun little panel conversation with people from different generations. And one of the people there was a brilliant attorney with a hippie background, an OG hippie, very sweet guy. But every once in a while, he came as he was sipping my scotch. He would become more loose in his frustration with the generation today, with us sitting there. It says, why aren't you out there protesting? When I was young, in my hippie days, we were constantly out there protesting. And it just occurred to me that so much damage has been done by the narcissism of hippies. The idea that students at Brown and Harvard and UCLA had any contribution to the civil rights movement because they were going up to upstate New York to have sex in the mud is so narcissistic and ahistorical. And that idea that teaches you that all you need is a sheet of paper and Sharpies, and then you get to legitimize your own importance in history, has caused so much damage.
I don't know. I'm thinking of, we haven't released it yet, but we have had our conversation with Arya Nair.
Yeah.
And I don't
know. Those were the real civil rights activists. Those were the people. Yeah. They're not the protesters in UCLA. Those are the people who go to the South and actually help the people who want to change their life constructively. The civil rights movement itself was profound because those were, first and foremost, Black Americans who wanted to change and improve their lives and fight against unjust laws. And they were out there marching. They're not having sex in upstate New York. They were out there marching to change the reality that actually harmed them. And then they were supported by different people who really made a difference, like Arya Nair and ACLU, who were there to not have fun, not to feel like they were important in the cosmic arc of history, but rather to do a lot of hard and boring work litigating and passing laws and defending the incipient civil rights movement in courts and in Congress and making the change. The kids were playing, but the kids tell themselves that because they went to Hollywood and they wrote the books, and so now the narrative was passed down that it was the hippies having sex in the mud that made the difference. They did not make the difference. That's all I'm saying.
Maybe. We'll never know how many people came for the sex and stayed for the justice.
Sorry about this.
Side tangent.
This is actually a fun way to transfer to your point about the other war. So it seems like we to put the cap on the Gaza story. where are we? All this was to explain how screwed we were to begin with, and we agree that strategically this was handled in halfways and did not address the underlying problem, which was the anti-Zionist Palestinianism ideology.
And just to go back to Dom's question of if I may, that why, I'm thinking from your response that it was in fact that kind of inkling of that broader narrative, that war being waged on a broader scale, that kept interfering essentially with decision makers' ability to make strong strategic decisions.
It's the fact that they didn't understand that what was happening globally was actually an assault.
I don't understand this. How does Netanyahu, who thinks of himself as this great savvy, talk about the placard strategy, right? He loves his placards. How does he and the people surrounding him, at least some of them, not understand from the get-go what was obvious to any sentient Israeli, that the attack on October 7th, obvious on October 8th, that the attack was just the launchpad to a global assault? How was that not obvious?
I'm not sure I have a really good and satisfying answer. It is, by the way, one of the reasons I've decided to go into politics, just the feeling of not just a complete failure of our leadership, but the fact that they don't seem to even understand where our real challenges lie, how you mobilize people. Here, I'll give you a recent example from, again, the same prime minister. One explanation will be that he had a lot of, he made a lot of political considerations that ultimately did not match. But I'll give you an example that is recent. As we were moving to the second phase in Gaza, he went to Israeli television to brief the public. And he said there, I prevented a Palestinian state and will continue to do so. Now, in the past, this is from a few days ago, okay? Now, in the past, when he said that, I would go to Twitter and I would do my favorite response, which is that it's not nice to take credit for the one achievement of the Palestinian national movement. Because the reason they don't have a state is not because any Israeli leader ever prevented it. In fact, not only is it also that, the amazing thing is that Netanyahu himself said several times yes to Palestinian state. When the first Trump proposal, people forget there was a Palestinian state there, to which Netanyahu said yes. And Abu Mazen, supposedly the moderate guy, said no, and 1,000 times no, in case anyone had any questions about it. But that's not how people remember it. But in factually, Israel is the one. But for a century, I always say, we say yes to every two-state solution, provided one of the two is the Jewish state. And the Arabs have consistently said no to every two-state solution if one of the two is the Jewish state. So when you have a prime minister that said, I prevented a Palestinian state, essentially trying to make a stupid political play to claim as if this is at all relevant, even though he's literally taking credit for a problem that doesn't really exist. But what he does in that is that he essentially gives fuel to people around the world, including our friends and allies, who say, okay, Israel is saying that it's the problem. And this actually prevents us as Israelis from mobilizing the friends and allies that we do have towards addressing the actual problem, which is Palestinianism, which is this total ideology of destruction. So this is not just at the beginning of the war. This is all the way now. Like, we actually have a prime minister who, prioritizes weird political arguments at the expense of helping Israel fight better, I would argue, an existential war that we seem to not understand how dangerous it is.
So, but doesn't that mean, in the same logic that we know that many of the Salam Fayyadists on the Palestinian Authority side, the people who did have momentarily a desire for reform, you had those individuals in brief period, the Saibari Katz, who indicated that maybe they can move a little bit, but ultimately were constrained partly because of the way negotiations played out with Israel, but largely because of their own public standing in their way and stopping them. As you pointed out, this is whenever a leadership wanted to reform the anti-Zionism as the primary key of the ideology, the public rebelled against them in some real, real physical threats. Not just you'll lose your political job. You might actually die. Your family is at risk. That kind of rebelling. So that violence, thankfully, yet is not part of Israeli political discourse, although there is a degree of brutalization happening in Israeli society that I'm certainly unhappy about. But the fact that Netanyahu still thrives politically by making these stupid plays, by claiming, I stopped the Palestinian state, which, as you say, means nothing and causes nothing but damage globally. But the fact that he is still winning politically by doing that, doesn't that indicate that Israel also has a public problem? It is. I don't think it is of the same scale as the Palestinian society's obsession with anti-Zionism, but there is clearly a sufficient electorate that rewards this kind of stupidity in Israel.
But it never rewards it under conditions of opportunity. This is exactly where the difference is. The difference is that when you have Palestinian Arab leaders who are willing to speak differently, they are literally embraced by Israel to the point that everyone says, don't embrace them so much because Israelis are so thrilled that there might actually be someone on the other side that focuses on building for themselves rather than destroying for us. The Israeli pattern is that whenever you have an Arab leader, sometimes I joke that I feel that if anything, I wish Israelis had a little more, we were not so overeager, because every time that you have an Arab leader who kind of just says something nice, we rush to try to negotiate or come to an agreement. So if you actually look at the patterns over decades, the clear patterns are that, again, the Jews always say yes. I mentioned it not because we're nice, but because we're small, as long as they get to be sovereign anywhere. Now, Netanyahu can say those things precisely because there's no challenge that requires him to actually test them. And then you can have he can present political, there's very strong still.
You mean there's no challenge? There's no challenge from the Palestinian side?
Yes. And in fact, whenever there was even a bit, again, Netanyahu's the guy who said yes multiple times. So for me, ultimately, the tragedy here is that there is, even if there is, look, it even goes deeper, because ultimately Netanyahu is supposedly someone that should have known that the Palestine Arabs are united in a destructive vision, and yet he chose to give it billions of dollars through UNRWA, through Qatar. The whole deception operation against Israel was based on deceiving Israel into believing that the people of Gaza just want to mind their own business. If you listen to what leaders of Hamas-ruled Gaza said after October 7th, they said, we led the Israelis to believe that we're only concerned with taking care of our people. Ha, ha, ha. Think about it. Think what it says. They literally understood that the best way to deceive Israelis is to lead Israelis to believe that the people of Gaza just wanted to take care of themselves rather than preparing this massive invasion and massacre. So I agree with you. We are, and again, one of the reasons I'm going into politics is that I think the era of thinking that we can buy a few more minutes of quiet, that we can run away from problems, that we can play domestic games while there is actual danger to Jewish life, I think that era is long gone, and we need the kind of leadership that actually understands the magnitude of the challenge and is ready to do what is necessary rather than play ridiculous games.
The deception around taking care of their own people goes back to my initial question, and again, something that I've encountered with many a peace privileged Westerner, the idea that that obviously every society seeks to attain the liberal lifestyle, and any other kind of talk about resistance as the priority or the destruction of Israel being the priority is merely reactionary or political facade. But in truth, underlying it, everybody just wants prosperity and thriving. The funny thing is that recently, and the internet is just full of incoherent psyops, so I don't know what to even make of it, but there has been a rush of voices in the international political online spaces who are overtly embracing that kind of third world resentment ideology as a rejection of prosperity and liberal prosperity as the goal. I've heard the phrase just the other day from one apologist for the Ayatollah regime saying that everything that you were seeing in Iran right now is a rebellion against toxic capitalism, which thinks that all people want is just more money and more goods. And what the Iranian regime, the Ayatollah regime, the Islamic Republic provides, I should stop calling it Islamic Republic, but the Islamic tyranny provides is meaning and direction and purpose. People need this direction and purpose, and that direction of purpose obviously is warfare against the West.
I mean, they might not be wrong. It does have direction.
Exactly. No, but that's the point. And it goes back to taking people at their word. Right. That is not a lie.
That's why it works.
It does work. And that is exactly why thinking that Hamas and the Gazan society, all that they wanted, all that they needed was that Qatari money to come in and for more workers in Gaza to be allowed to go and labor in Israel and make some money. That's all that was required in order for the society to de-radicalize and become a beautiful liberal utopia. That is such a tempting notion for Western peace privileged minded liberals who like myself really want to see the world turning more into liberal enlightenment, but is just not in line with human reality. Because in human reality, some people, some societies, some cultures can be driven more by the zealousy of their mission. By the way, you can find that in the margins of Israeli society with the settlers, for instance, who care a lot less about material prosperity than they do about the push of their mission. And zealousy is a thing that exists in all cultures. Again, it's not an essentialist thing. It is an ideological strain that can infect anybody and overrides dreams about prosperity and would prioritize your own martyrdom over quote unquote toxic capitalism. So I want to just turn before you have to go. We talk about the global war. So we're in this middling, annoying state in the Gaza war, and now we are just waiting for Trump to tell us what to do, I suppose. So that's great. I'm a big fan of imperialism. So I'm waiting for the emperor to tell us what's next. In the meantime, if we are in this uncertain limbo with the real war in Gaza, and who knows what's going to happen with Iran. Israel had some success in Lebanon, at least. That's aesthetic success at minimum. But globally, the mission of turning anti-Zionism establishing anti-Zionism as the hinge point around which the global cosmic war between good and evil revolves, has been successful. We have labor unions all across America making anti-Zionism as one of their preconditions. We have the New York Department of Housing giving lectures about anti-Zionism. We have the environmental movements, artist guilds, everybody. They're seeing anti-Zionism as that raison d'etre, that real drive that gives their empty Western lives meaning. Seems like we've lost that war.
First of all, I am deeply concerned because those kinds of assaults, and they're not new, that have been waged on Jews since World War II under the guise of anti-Zionism in the Arab world, in Iran, and the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, before and during World War II under anti-Semitism, and before that in different ways, they always end with an assault on Jewish life. Because once you bring people to the belief, and we are living through a global mass manipulation, that people are led to the belief that the only thing that stands between them and utopia and a better world, and whatever the better world is in their mind, that the only thing that stands between them and utopia is the collective Jew. The next step, historically, is to try to get rid of the individual Jews that together make up the collective Jew. And it's very dangerous.
I should say this is the Dara Horn formulation of anti-Semitism, the notion that anti-Semitism is the Jewish is that one thing that stands in the way of whatever end goal you may have.
Exactly. And if that end goal is utopia, then in the name of getting to utopia, every atrocity is justified by any means necessary, right? Because the world that would emerge on the other side of getting rid of the collective Jew just would be so perfect. So any atrocity that we will commit, that's why the euphoria and the ecstasy on October 7th, because what they saw on social media was essentially the violent birthing of utopia, the ridding of the collective Jew one by one. So it has gone global. It is dangerous. And I believe we need to address it in two ways. One, actually prepare for real risk scenarios within Israel, around the Jewish world. And two, is to work with whatever allies we have who are beginning to understand that this is a very dangerous ideology that doesn't end well, certainly not for the Jews, but also not for their societies. And here I pose a question that I guess only history will answer. Is America truly exceptional? Even though this is happening in Australia and in France and in Britain and in Canada, ultimately the country that will determine whether the tide is turned is the United States of America. And the question is it exceptional? And I say that much of my hopes now ride on one video that went viral shortly after October 7th, when you remember that these overtitled, college students were tearing down the hostage posters, especially of the children. And there were two construction workers, I think it was in Queens, one Black, one Hispanic, I think, who basically turned to the college student who was doing that and said, "This is not right. Stop it." And I remember looking at that and wondering, I wonder if this is still America, if the United States of America, now after Bud Bunny, we have to say the full name, the United States of America is still the country that has this foundational common sense, which, as you know, is not so common, that is able to look at the manifestations of this toxic ideology and say, it's not right, stop it. And I think this is where the pivot will be. Is the United States of America truly exceptional?
I always believed in that idea of the normie voter, the American normie, as the guarantor of American liberalism, because liberalism requires some virtue from leadership, and sadly, it requires some virtue from the institutions, but it doesn't depend on that primarily. What it does require is a good, healthy, normie population. And without that good, healthy, normie population, a republic cannot be preserved. That common sense, that culture of common sense that is not necessarily super educated, is not necessarily super sophisticated. Sophistication can actually lead to corruption, and overeducation can lead to insanity. But a basic normie desire to live a normal life is the only way to recognize the temptation of toxic, truly toxic ideologies. Prioritize your own family, your own protection. That is the guarantor of liberalism in the long run. I don't know if that thing really exists anymore for multiple reasons. The financial weirdness that America is in right now, the alienation of the culture, and the reality distorting sources of information that we live in day by day. I don't know if the normie legacy can withstand all these forces.
In a weird way, I feel like it might all rely on some influencer. If America is truly the linchpin in this global war, then if it's the American normie, they need a cultural figure.
I don't think that Israel needs to be defended. This is why Hasbara sucks. The problem isn't the let's go rah Israel. The problem is let's get rid of anti-Zionism.
Right, but how do you do that without?
But the point is not to defend Israel, and I'm far from somebody who is rah defend Israel, and I don't think that's the right thing to do. I think anti-Zionism is a vile ideology all by itself. I should not even have to say this. It has nothing to do with a critical lens applied to Israel. It has everything to do with the psychology and the ideological entrapment of the people themselves. Nothing to do with Israel. So being against Nazism should have nothing to do with what you think about Judaism as a religion or a people or whatever. You might say like, I don't believe that Jewish peoplehood makes sense anymore in the 19th century. Yeah, you might have that view. That doesn't mean that you're a Nazi, right? Nazism should be resisted because it is a self-destructing, vicious ideology all on its own. And I don't know what to do about that because anti-Zionism seems to be seeping into every aspect of American elite society and not just elite society. So what do you think, Einat? You called it the placard strategy, which is the idea that anti-Zionist protesters of the past 2 years have systematically created messaging in their campaigns that create an equivalence between the Star of David on one side and whatever is bad on the other. So it could be global warming, colonialism, imperialism, everything is in equivalence to the Star of David. And therefore, we are crawling towards a total rejection of the Jewish state from all fronts and recognizing that it is the enemy that needs defeating in no matter what battle you care about. Do you feel like we've moved away from that? Because we are seeing less direct protests. We're seeing there is less energy now that the war is over, but at the same time, it seems like the placard strategy has moved away from placards and into the absorption of these ideologies into local organizations. Like I said, I mentioned labor unions as one example. This is in a way more covert and more UNRWA-like. What do we do?
First, we need to understand what it is, that it is an assault on Jewish life wherever Jewish life is, under the cover of supposedly a respectable discourse about Israel. But it is, and everywhere it was allowed to be institutionalized, no Jews were left. I will end so that we will end with a positive. We do have the Jewish people. We have friends. We have allies. We have people who, even when they don't have the full language, saying that this is the placard strategy, that anti-Zionism is a toxic, destructive ideology, they understand that something is deeply wrong. And I think the more that we can work with allies and friends to help them see sooner rather than later that nothing good ever came from a mass manipulated population that believes that utopia waits on the other side of ridding the society of the collective Jew, I think the more we will be able to get people, leaders, local leaders, to stand up and to see it for what it is. And in parallel, I do think that we need to prepare for also risk and survival scenarios, but also work but also work with friends and allies to help them try to, again, work against the tide rather than go through the whole spiral of destruction and only wake up when it's too late. That's the part I fear, because sometimes, societies wake up after they caused the destruction to the Jews to say, oh my God, that was such a terrible ideology. Can we actually this time stop it before it goes all the way to the destruction? That's what I hope that people will actually learn from history, because this is an established pattern that by now societies should be able to recognize and recoil from and say, we actually don't want to go there.
Okay, so before I let you go, I have a question from a listener. This will be our goodbye question. A listener and a friend. She's already decided to go for the survival approach, and she is writing to us from a bunker in somewhere in New England. And she asks, if you are elected into a position of power in Israeli politics, will you agree to form a ministry of trolling, Misrad Hatrala, that will replace all efforts of Hasbara for just making a clown show of the international community that has beclowned itself over the past decade? And one of the suggestions is joining every vote that condemns Israel in the UN and voting against Israel, supporting that vote. Or now that there was a talk about whether or not the Italian Nazi Francesca Albanese should be removed from her position as a UN rapport, Israel should go and defend her and speak to her credit. Things like that. Is that will you consider this as a useful development in Israeli PR?
I don't know about the specific examples, but the idea as a whole is one of the most interesting and original ideas I've heard in a while, I have to say. And I must admit, I will leave this conversation thinking about it.
I will say that if you do find yourself in a position, she will willingly take over all your strategy for this department.
Very good.
Well, Einat, thank you. I hope to talk again soon, and we definitely will talk about Oz. Good luck.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're feeling generous, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends and enemies. Until next time, stay sane.